Hey, welcome guys, it's Bob here. I was looking on YouTube to see if I could find a video about steam boiler maintenance. I couldn't find anything, so I decided to shoot this screencast about my procedure and what I do for my own customers when I do a full startup. Now folks, this is my way of doing things. It's not the only way of doing things, and to all you pros out there who may agree or disagree with me, put your comments down below. I'd love to hear how you guys do it. And to all you homeowners, I highly recommend you hire a heating professional. Now, this particular screencast is about steam heat because steam heat is king here in the New York City area, but it could apply to a hydronic boiler as well. This is a residential boiler that I'm presenting in this screencast. Keep that in mind. So watch it, enjoy the information, and I will catch you on the other side of this video. Oops, I almost forgot. Get lost. All right, I first want to say that I don't really recommend homeowners do their own annual steam boiler maintenance, but if you feel you want to give it a shot, I say go for it. And to the pros watching this, I just want to say this is my way of doing things. It's not the only way of doing things. I'd be interested in knowing how you guys do things. Leave your comments down below. But again, I'll walk you through what I do when I go through an annual cleaning, maintenance, etc. So essentially, first thing I'm going to do, and depending upon the time of year they call me, I mean, I have customers usually calling me right after Labor Day, which in my opinion is a little too soon. I like to go in November where I can actually run the system, without having to worry about, have steam come up when it's like 75 degrees outside. So I prefer November, December, but a lot of times, certain people get cold really early and hey, so whatever floats their boat. Anyway, when I essentially get to the job site, the first place I go is to where the thermostat is. We talk about the programming of it, the times they want it to come on, the temperatures they'd like it to be during the day. And before I make my trip down to the basement, I will turn that thermostat at least 5 degrees above room temperature. In actuality, I bump it all the way up because I just want to make sure it's calling for heat when I get downstairs. On my way downstairs, I'm going to be looking for any old, maybe emergency switches that may have been left there from perhaps an old oil boiler that was taken out, where they have the emergency electrical switches in the stairwell. I want to make sure that switch is on. A lot of times I've gone on a no heat call only to find the switch in the stairwell in the off position, and they didn't realize it. They thought it was a light switch and didn't realize it had to do with the heat. Anyway, we get down to the boiler room. All things being equal, with the thermostat calling for heat and all the switches on the boiler on, that boiler should be running. Now, if it is running, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to shut the emergency switch on the boiler off so I can get it to stop running. Next thing I'm generally going to do is I'm going to drain all the water out of the boiler. So once I get all the water drained out of the boiler, I actually am going to flick that switch back on again. And what should happen is that it may come on momentarily, and then it should shut off. The low water cutoff should actually activate and shut it off because I have then removed all the water from the boiler. And we're just going to assume everything's working the way it should be. This is not a troubleshooting guide. It's basically a maintenance guide. So I drained all the water out of the boiler. I flicked the emergency switch back on again, and that low water cutoff did in fact shut the boiler down, which is great. So at that point, I'm going to shut that emergency switch off again. So the next thing I'm probably going to do, I have a couple of choices here. I could either address the chimney, and in this case, you're going to see a clean out access there. And if it does have a clean out access, that's great because I can just open up that door, look inside. If there's a buildup of whatever, perhaps some birds, perhaps a squirrel, I can just clean it out, get a bucket, take everything out of there, and I'm good to go. Now, a lot of the jobs I go on, there is no clean out access. The flue pipe actually enters at the point where you see that access door, and I actually have to take the flue pipe apart, and I actually will pull it apart to look inside the chimney. Because, like I said, a lot of times in the wintertime, birds get up at the top there and they sit at the top of the chimney to keep warm, and ultimately they end up falling in. I've taken squirrels out myself too. Anyway, so once I pull all the flue pipe apart and I'm satisfied that the chimney looks great, I'll put everything back together again and I'll zip screw everything back the way it should be. And I just want to make a note. The chimney should be pitching upwards, or the flue pipe should be pitching upwards toward the chimney, 1/8 to 1/4 inch minimum. If it's back pitched, you have to address that. But again, we're not going to get into how I go about doing that, because this is basically a quick walk through maintenance. And by the way, I devote about an hour to each one of my startups. So I know to a lot of guys that may be a little bit too much time, but I feel that's what you have to go through when you're doing a startup. So anyway, we got the chimney back together. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the burner box, and I'm going to take a look in there, and I'm going to probably, if I can remove the burners easily, I'm going to remove all the burners. I'm going to vacuum them one by one. I'm going to take a look in there. I'm going to see if there's a pilot, to make sure the pilot is on. If it's electronic ignition, this is not going to apply. If I can't get the burners out easily, I will get my shop vac and put a series of attachments on there, and I will vacuum out that burner box to the best of my ability, as best I can with the access I have. So now we have all the water out of the boiler. I'm satisfied that the low water cutoff has shut the boiler off. We addressed the chimney. We did a little vacuuming around the burners, or we actually took the burners out and vacuumed them. So the next place I'm going to go to is the glass gauge. Now, I change the glass gauge every year, or the sight glass. The ends of the sight glass, where they enter the upper and lower valves, they have a tendency of getting thin, especially, if we had a crazy winter and this thing is running like the dickens. If you actually take the glass gauge out and look at the ends of the glass, they get thin, they wear. So I take the glass gauge out, and I actually will get a new glass gauge prepared with new nuts, new washers, and new friction washers. It's relatively inexpensive to do, and so I just do it. Now, before I put the new glass in, what I will do is I will take the bottom gauge glass valve or gauge glass cock apart. I actually will unscrew the stem, and at that point, I flick that emergency switch back on again, and you have an automatic water feeder shown here. And I'll just talk about manual feed in a second, but assuming we have both the low water cutoff and the automatic water feeder together, what should happen is there should be a timeout, and this boiler should start to feed water in automatically. Now, it's not going to fill the boiler up to one level at one time. That automatic feeder is going to cycle on and off. It's going to run for a minute. It's going to shut. It's going to run for a minute. It's going to shut. And it's going to do that until the level gets to that of above the low water cutoff. And generally with an electronic low water cutoff, because of where they have it placed in the boiler, the glass is probably going to fill a third. And, a lot of people feel that's too low, but that's the nature of the beast. That's where they put the probe in the boiler. And basically when the water gets just above the probe, it shuts, it stops the automatic feeder from feeding everything in again. Anyway, we're going to assume everything filled up. And actually, when the water starts coming out of that bottom sight glass valve or sight glass cock, I actually will get a metal rod and shove it in there. And I'm going to basically skim some of that dirty water off of the bottom of the gauge glass cock. and I'll get a bucket and stick it under there, and I will just leave the bucket there until the water runs relatively clean. At that stage, I'm going to put that valve back together again, and I will install my glass gauge, my new glass gauge. So now we have gone through the process of checking the flue, vacuuming out the burner boxes. We took all the water out, the low water cutoff, shut the boiler off. Now we put the emergency switch on again, and we verified that the feeder is feeding. So the feeder and the low water cutoff are communicating. It got to level. It stopped feeding, and now the boiler comes on. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to let that boiler run. And in some cases, I'll let it run, get a head of steam up. In other cases, depending upon my workload, I may not do that. So the next thing I'm going to do now is, now that the boiler is running, I'm going to go to the pressure control, as you can see noted on this little illustration here. And I'm going to take the cover off, and I'm manually going to flick up. There's a little spring in there, a spring-loaded switch. And I'm actually going to flick that switch up, or I'm going to break the circuit on purpose. If I don't want to wait for the system to build enough pressure to flick that switch, I'm manually going to do it. And the boiler should shut. And if the boiler shuts, great. And I will do that a couple of times. I will click it on, I will click it off, I will click it on, I will click it off. I want to make sure it resets itself. And then I will, again, interrupt the circuit. And I'll do that a couple of times. And once I'm satisfied, I will put the cover to the pressure control back. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the spill switch. And depending upon the model of the spill switch, I'll either, remove it from the draft diverter, and I will heat it up with a match or a striker, and I'll purposely get it to shut down. So once I heat that spill switch up, it should get to a point where it shuts the entire boiler down. And that's what it's supposed to do. That's what it's designed to do. Basically, that spill switch keeps you alive. God forbid that chimney stops up. So if it's a resettable one, I will hit the reset button. The boiler should come back on again. If it's not resettable, I got to wait for it to cool off. And that really doesn't take all that long. So now we got the boiler running. Everything's doing what it's supposed to do. And at that stage, I'm basically going to do a wipe down of the jacket. I'll get my WD-40 with a rag. I'll clean everything down. I'll vacuum any dust, crazy heavy buildup of dust around. And you're going to see the relief valve there. And the relief valve, if you're going to wait around for a head of steam, or for the system to be completely full with steam to see if that relief valve works, you can do that depending upon the size of the house. It may take a while for that to happen, but I generally don't stick around for that, because that would take up a little bit too much time. But for the most part, relief valves, in my experience, if they're bad, they're bad. You're really not going to know until they actually relieve. And the only reason a relief valve should relieve, is because of excessive pressure. But if a relief valve relieves, it's basically telling you there's something going on with the pressure control, or the pressure control didn't shut it off. So real quickly, pressure controls, I try to get them to shut off at a pound and a half, even less if I can, but some of the pressure controls, you're not able to go that low. And the relief valves are set to pop at 15 PSI. So if it gets to the point where the relief valve popped, and this system actually ran to 15 PSI, something's going on. You need to get it checked out. So I just want to real quickly, I'm going to say about this illustration here, I'm showing an electronic feeder and an electronic low water cutoff. You may not have that. You may not have the modern day versions of these controls. You may still have the old analog, I like to call them. McDonnell Miller is the manufacturer. They make the old McDonnell Miller number 67 low water cutoff, the 101 and the 101-24 feeders. These are the new electronic versions. Again, you may or may not have these. You may have the analog versions, but they still work kind of like the same way. Again, this is a maintenance thing. I'm just going in to make sure everything's doing what it's supposed to do. I'm not going in doing, repairs or trying to figure out, system problems, because basically they're calling me in for maintenance. If I find stuff, I'm going to look further. But real quickly, I just want to go over the water supply there. So in New York City, we require a backflow preventer on the water supply. So you're going to see that up top. And we're coming down, you see the boiler water supply valve. And then it tees off the feeder valve. It goes back down into the water line and then back into the boiler. And you're going to see a check valve down there at the bottom. So in New York City, we need a check valve, and that's a spring-loaded check for those of you who are going to say it's in the wrong position. It's a spring-loaded check. And you're going to see a manual bypass valve. That manual bypass valve there is in case we have a malfunctioning feeder, or let's say the feeder doesn't shut off for whatever reason. So you're able to shut the feeder valve and still put water in via the manual bypass. And for those of you who don't have an automatic water feeder and still put water in by hand, I always tell my customers, fill the sight glass up to about 3/4 full. Again, with a low water cutoff, it's only probably going to get to about 1/3. But if you have a manual feeder, I always advocate filling it up to about 3/4 full. And at that point, folks, everything is running. I'm pretty satisfied that, everything is doing what it's supposed to do. And basically, that's my procedure. Now, I just want to mention one thing here. I would advocate using a metal bucket when you're draining the water out of the boiler. And let me back up real quickly. That boiler drain, sometimes I'll open that boiler drain and nothing comes out because it's clogged. And if that happens, I actually will take the valve off completely. Again, I carry some metal rods with me, and I will clear out that. Generally, it's a nipple. I know in this illustration, it's showing that it's a long piece of pipe coming out of the side of the boiler, but that's not always the case. It's generally a 3 or 4 inch nipple coming out of the side of the boiler, and I'll have to take that valve off and clear that out. And I would say to people, don't use a plastic bucket. And I say this from experience because sometimes the one time I got burned, the boiler had been running, and this was late in the afternoon. It was on a cold winter day. The boiler had been running. They were having problems with the boiler. They had a plastic bucket there, and this thing must have been running for a while, and the water that was coming out of this boiler was unbelievably hot. And I filled the bucket up, and I went to lift it to go take it to a drain, and the bucket actually collapsed on top of my boot. And by the time I got my boot off, I burned all the skin off the top of my foot. So it was not pretty. And I strongly recommend you getting a metal bucket because you don't want to get that water on you. So at that point, folks, I'm vacuumed, I'm dusted, I get my service sticker saying you're good to go for the season. And that's it, guys. So, I mean, I don't know how other pros do it. For me, this has worked. Again, I devote about an hour to the whole process. And generally, if there's something wrong, I'm going to find it at that point. I know a lot of guys like to sell maintenance contracts and guarantee controls, et cetera, during the course of the heating season. But I kind of am from the school that if there's a problem while I'm there, because I devote enough time to find problems. And if there is a problem, I will point that out to my customer. And at that point, we can address it right there and then, rather than wait for an emergency to take place in the middle of the winter. And I may or may not be able to get to them. I can tell you my experience from the utility companies, from the consumers that have bought the utility companies' maintenance programs, and we guarantee the controls, and we'll guarantee this, and we'll guarantee that. Their experience has been when they've actually needed them. For instance, they have no heat or they have no hot water. will get to you in 3 or 4 days. And to me, that's like ridiculous. I mean, 3 or 4 days. So what do they need a maintenance? If you can't get to them when they need you, what's the point? Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. To you homeowners who are thinking about maybe going through this process, uh, I strongly recommend you call a pro in to do this. And to the pros that have watched this, give me your comments. I'm sure they're going to be good ones and bad ones down below. But I got a strong stomach. I think I can take it. So there you go, guys. My process, or as stated here, a beginner's guide to annual steam boiler maintenance. So there you go, guys. I hope you got some useful information out of this screencast. One thing I didn't mention was after everything is said and done, you got to go back upstairs and don't forget to lower your thermostat or put it back to a normal setting. Otherwise, that heat's going to be running all day. Folks, if you enjoyed the video, if you're enjoying the channel, I highly recommend you subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be notified of when I post a new video. But more importantly, I want you to hit that like button. When you hit that like button, that's telling YouTube you're enjoying these videos, and they'll push the videos out in front of more eyes, thereby helping more people. Folks, I want to thank you as always for stopping by. Keep an eye out for one of these 2 videos that are going to pop up here to your right. One of them I chose and one of them YouTube chose. And I hope you enjoy either or. Anyway, as always, thanks again for stopping by the channel. I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Stay well, and as always, happy plumbing.